All right. Open your Bibles, please, to Genesis chapter 37. That's where we left off last week. Genesis 37. If you're new with us today, we hope you will want to come and be a part of our class, unless you already have one. I know Pearl's got a class that's not meeting today. But unless you already have a class, we invite you to come and be a part of our class anytime and every time you would like to. What we're doing this time, our third time through the Bible, took us 9 years to go through the first time. We did every verse of every chapter. Took us 11 years the second time when we were using more material from scholars. I just taught what I knew that first time through, and we moved a little more quickly. This time we're dealing just with the greatest stories in the Bible, and we're using a lot of Genesis, and we'll use a lot of Exodus because they are really essential. If you're going to understand the Hebrew Scriptures, you have to be able to deal intelligently with Genesis and Exodus. If you can deal intelligently and faithfully with those two, you really have the core of Judaism. It really is there. Doesn't mean that the other 37 scrolls are unimportant, but those two really have the heart of it. You have the patriarchs in Genesis, and then you have all the Moses stories in Exodus. So we'll be spending more time in those two books than we will in the books that follow. But I think it's really important that you see what masterful storytellers these ancient folk were, who around campfires of shepherds, they were shepherds for hundreds of years. Their stories got told again and again and again. Finally put down after David had built the new city of Jerusalem, and Solomon got the temple built, and you had an educated priesthood who could read and write. Then finally things got put down. Gail and I were watching a television program the other night that was asking the question, can we find anything in archaeological evidence about someone as great as King David was? Strangely enough, they had found nothing that directly tied to the historical David until a few years ago. And it was not in Jerusalem that they found something that tied directly to David. It was from one of the other tribes who were fighting against him. And in one of their ancient, it's called a stele, in one of their steles, there it was, the family of David. The family of David. And so outside the Bible, we really had no historical scientific evidence, even for someone as great as David. And we have nothing written by Jews before the time of King David. And we know, that David's realm and the founding of Jerusalem came just almost exactly the year 1000 before the Common Era. So everything before that, oral tradition that finally got put down. All right, last Sunday we left off at a very significant place. This jealousy of Joseph's brothers, that he had fed and stoked himself by telling them that he was constantly having dreams where they bowed down to him. They bowed down to him. His father favoring him by giving him a very special robe. One time he was wearing this robe when his father said, go check on your older brothers. Sheep would graze for miles, sometimes 3 or 4 days walk from the main camp. And when Joseph got that far from home, the brothers thought, okay, this is the time for us to deal with him. And first they thought they'd kill him. And then they decided, well, no, why don't we sell him into slavery? We get rid of him, and we make a little money as well. So that's what they did. And we think the oldest of the stories, the J source we call them the E source, and we won't revisit that every week, but the J source and the E source, because here we have, they sold him to the Ishmaelites, they sold him to the Midianites, and you have both of those names right there mentioned 3 different times each, and so we think the two stories, got pushed up together when the priest finally put them together. So Ishmaelites, descendants of that son of Abraham, through the slave girl, others calling the tribal group that took Joseph in their caravan to Egypt, the Midianites. And Moses, 600 years later, when he fled from the Egyptians, would end up marrying a Midianite himself. So these old tribal groups get mentioned time and time again. Verse 28 of chapter 37 is where we left off, and that's where we'll begin right after we pray. God, this is your book. You've taken really good care of it for centuries, and we know that you can take care of it now. We don't have to be afraid to look as closely as we know how, to learn as much as we possibly can, but help us ask the right questions. Knowing this is a book about you, not about other scientific disciplines, just it's a book about you. So what are you doing on each and every page, every chapter, every book? What are you doing? And how can we understand you better by looking at what you were doing at any given time in history? We offer our best effort in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, verse 28 of chapter 37 ends, and they took Joseph to Egypt. You see that? All right, verse 31. I'm just going to skip to the most important parts as I see them. Verse 31. So after he's gone, either with Ishmaelites or Midianites, they've got to go home and tell their father. But they're not going to tell him the truth, of course. So they took Joseph's robe, that beautiful one that they hated, because they didn't have one like it, slaughtered a goat, and dipped the robe in the blood. They had the long robe with sleeves taken to their father, and they said, "This we have found." In other words, we didn't see it happen, but here's the evidence of what's taken place. See now whether it is your son's robe or not. Of course, they know it's Joseph's robe. But since the father had it made, the father gave it to him, this is sort of an in-your-face sort of thing. You tell us, is this the robe you gave him? You certainly didn't give the others of us any such robe. He recognized it and said, that means Jacob, he recognized it and said, "It is my son's robe." And then he jumps to conclusions. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments, put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted, and said, "No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning." Let me remind you about Sheol. It's almost never translated because there's not a single word that translates it. But Sheol was basically a place of dampness and darkness, a burial place, a tomb. The Greeks have a word that corresponds. It's the word Hades. Hades does not describe a hot and fiery place. It describes a cold, damp place, like a tomb or a grave. So all Jacob is saying is, I'll go to my death, mourning this son. Thus his father bewailed him. Meanwhile, and here they use the word Midianites again, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Okay, so let's just recap quickly, because then we're going to jump, and we're going to spend a lot of time in Egypt from this point. Remember, the story focuses on one son. Esau has left the storyline at this point. We're following Jacob. And now we're going to follow not these other 10 sons, or the younger one, Benjamin. We're going to follow Joseph. Joseph is going to be the one who represents the promise and hope for the community. And he's the one who's down in Egypt. He's a slave, and he's been sold to Potiphar. Okay. Notice again the sorrow that's come into Jacob's life. We won't belabor these things over and over, but I want you just to remember, he had spent 20 years away from his mother and father, because he and his mother had plotted against his father, had deceived his father. And when he finally got home, the father was there, the mother had died. So the one who had helped him, the one who had favored him, was gone, and the one whom he had deceived was still there. So as Dr. Brandon Scott kept saying to us when he was talking about the parables of Jesus, you always have to ask, what happens to the next generation? When he told you the story of the prodigal son, one son who's wasted half of the family's goods finally comes home, and the father kills a fatted calf and strikes up the band, puts a gold ring on his finger, and there's much singing and dancing. The older son, who's never left his father's side, who's worked for his father all these years, will not come into the dancing. And Dr. Scott said, what happens when the father dies? The two brothers still have to deal with each other at that point. Okay, so here's Jacob. He's living with sons who are not his favorites. He favors Joseph and Benjamin because he favored their mother over the women who birthed the other sons. And so here he is. He's stuck now with the ones whom he's not favored, the ones for whom he's not made a beautiful robe, and the one whom he loves better than his own life, he thinks is dead, and he's grieved his death. Let's jump to chapter 39. 38 is not one of the major stories in my opinion. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt. It picks up again because 38 sort of stuck in there, but again, we're not going to deal with that. You can on your own if you like. Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites. And notice how these names are used back and forth. Ishmaelites and Midianites were not the same tribal group. That's why we believe when the tribes were divided for at least 200 years, when they got to Canaan, Joshua led them across the river, remember. They divided themselves again, north and south, 10 against 2, because they felt favored, not favored. Sons of favored sons, sons of not favored sons. And that the stories told around the northern campfires, the stories told around the south, varied slightly. And one of them is the naming of the caravan that took Joseph down to Egypt. It's not a major point. I'm just trying to show you why folks that talk to you about the inerrancy of Scripture don't really know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're talking about. They know 10 verses they can recite any hour of the day or night, but they don't understand the Bible. Good scholars don't use words like inerrant because we know that this is the work of real people, and they did the best they could to preserve these stories about their relationship with God, but they are not inerrant, if you would. Okay. The Lord was with Joseph. Now notice again, I'll mention this to you more than once. The Lord here translates the name given to Moses at the burning bush. No one had that name until the time of Moses. We're still 600 years before Moses. So what does that tell you? Obviously the story is being told after Moses. And the storyteller knows the name because he's doing his work after Moses. So here is the name given to Moses at the burning bush. The I am who I am was with Joseph, even though Joseph didn't know that was his name. You understand? The name Joseph knows is El, or Elohim. He doesn't know I am who I am, but the storyteller knows because he's talking many years later. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man. Starts out as a slave, but if God is on your side, you've got a real leg up here. No question about it. He was in the house of his Egyptian master. Now his master saw that the I am who I am was with him. Now obviously Potiphar doesn't know the name, but if you do well, people in old times assumed your God must be a powerful God. If your army wins, your God must be bigger than the God of the losing army. That was the way they thought. So if Potiphar sees that here's a slave who is delivered to me with nothing, and he's managed my affairs so wonderfully well, his God, whoever that is, must be with him. And that the I am who I am caused all that he did to prosper in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight, that is Potiphar's, and attended him. Potiphar, the pronouns here, you have to look for antecedents because they're not really clear, but the translators are trying to translate exactly what they found. So we have Joseph and Potiphar back and forth, and you have to sort of sort out the pronouns. But he, meaning Potiphar in this case, made him, Joseph, overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. Skip to the last part of verse 6. Now Joseph was handsome and good looking. What you'll find in these stories is that all the ones God chooses are handsome and good looking. It's like Garrison Keillor's stories of Lake Wobegon. All the children in Lake Wobegon are above average. The guys are handsome, the girls are pretty, and they're all above average. Well, the Jews saw themselves that way. Storytellers saw it that way. Those who lead us, they're strong and good looking. So Joseph was handsome and good looking. And after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." But he refused. And he goes into a little speech about why that's terribly wrong. Look at verse 9. "How then could I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" This is Joseph's question. Notice here Jewish theology, and that is, if you do something wrong, like committing adultery, because this woman is married. Joseph isn't married. If she were not, it'd be fornication. She is married, so it's adultery. If I were to commit adultery with you, I would be sinning against my people's God. David will finally come to that understanding himself, hundreds of years later, that you can't just sin against one of the men in your army by sleeping with his wife. When you do, you've sinned against God as well. Okay. Verse 10. "And although she spoke to Joseph day after day, she keeps begging him, he would not consent to lie beside her or to be with her. One day, however," skip to verse 12, "she caught hold of his garment, saying, 'Lie with me.' But he jerks loose. He left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside. And what did she do? She screamed rape." Verse 14, "She called out to the members of her household and said to them, 'See, my husband has brought among us a Hebrew to insult us.'" Now this Hebrew was good enough to sleep with her, she thought, but now that he's refused and rejected her, then she uses it as a taunt, as something hateful. "My husband brought this man in to insult us. He came in to me to lie with me. And I cried out with a loud voice." I scared him away. Verse 16. But she holds on to the evidence, Hold on to the blue dress. It will help you. "She kept his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, 'The Hebrew servant whom you brought among us came in to me to insult me. But as soon as I raised my voice and cried out, he left his garment beside me and fled outside.'" Now, if you're Potiphar, which one are you going to believe? You're going to believe your wife, of course, because you want to think she would not ever have slept with this slave of his. So when his master, Potiphar, heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, "This is the way your servant treated me," he became enraged. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. He remained there in prison. But notice verse 21. This is good Hebrew, Jewish theology. "But the I am who I am was with Joseph and showed him chesed." Okay? This word right up here has a rough breathing mark over it. So you have to sort of, go chesed. And it's the one word used more than any other in all 39 scrolls of the Hebrew Scriptures to describe the very nature of God. Steadfast love, never failing love, constant love. Sometimes, slightly different preceding words, but always the idea is love. We fail, God does not fail. We break covenant, God does not break covenant. We are not loving, God is loving. So, this is a story, but there's theology here. What are we learning about God? Joseph is all by himself in Egypt. He has no family. He has no friends anywhere nearby. They're hundreds of miles away in the desert. But he has God. God has caused him to prosper. And now, when he's done the right thing, and Potiphar's wife has done the wrong thing, God is not going to abandon him. God's steadfast love is going to be there for Joseph. And of course, the implication is, you can see these people sitting around the campfire listening to this story, and if God is with Joseph, then all we have to do is wait till something else good happens to him. But it isn't happening right now. He's thrown into prison. And of course, when you have kings and you get thrown into prison, often they just forget you're there. You can just stay there forever. They forget. All right, let's go to chapter 40. Verse 2. After he's been there, we don't know just how long he's been there, Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer, who was to bring him the best wines and so on, and the chief baker. And he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. Would you believe this? In the very prison where Joseph was confined. Oh, wow. This has got to be good. Sooner or later, this has got to be good. Verse 5. One night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison. Verse 6. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today? What's wrong, fellows?" And they said to him, "We've had dreams, and there's no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, notice here, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me, since I'm a friend of God." That's what he's saying. Okay, let me go back with you. J and E. The J source, the E source. In the J passages, most often God just walks right up and speaks to folks. "Morning, Adam. You all right? I'm fine. How are you, Eve? I'm okay." But as someone would raise a question, now, did God really speak to you? Did God really speak to your ears? Well, no, I heard him in my heart. He came to me in a vision, in a dream. And so in the E passages, you have a lot of emphasis on dreams and people who can interpret dreams. And this is certainly one of those pretty long passages here where dream interpretation is very important. And Pharaoh can interpret dreams, and those who work for Pharaoh can interpret dreams, but God's man can interpret dreams. Please, tell them to me. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me." Remember, he serves up wine to the king. "And on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms came out, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation." "Ah, I have it," he said. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But remember me when it is well with you." Now, this Hebrew word for it's being well with you is the word shalom. Shalom is not only peace, it is well-being. When you know shalom, don't forget your buddy Joseph, okay? Because they've forgotten me here. I'm in prison, and they've all forgotten me. Don't forget me. All right, verse 16. It's the baker's turn. And when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he got a little more courage, you see. He said to Joseph, well, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head. You know that in more primitive cultures, they often carry heavy loads on their head in baskets, bread in particular. In the uppermost basket, there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang it on a pole, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. Now, on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast. Verse 21, he restored the chief cupbearer to his cupbearing, and he placed the cup, meaning the cupbearer did, in Pharaoh's hand. But the chief baker he hanged, just as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Okay, the theology here is everybody else in the world may forget you, but God will not. When Hagar was forced out of Abraham's tent, when Sarah became jealous, Abraham grieved about this son Ishmael, but he did nothing about it. Sarah didn't grieve at all. She certainly did nothing about it. The one who came to Hagar and Ishmael in the desert where they were dying was God. Okay. So this is what you're looking for when you read the Bible. You're not looking for, inerrancy. I mean, is the tribal name consistent? Always Ishmaelites or always Midianites? No, that's not what you find, that kind of consistency. What you find is insight. Insight about God. Who is God? How are faithful people treated? Okay, so everybody's forgotten Joseph. He's still rotting away in prison. But you and I know, and the people who huddle around campfires know, Israel's God does not ever forget. Okay. Chapter 41. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And there came up out of the Nile 7 sleek and fat cows, and they grazed in the reed grass. Then 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came up out of the Nile after them and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. The ugly and thin cows ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. And Pharaoh awoke, sat straight up in his bed. Then he fell asleep and dreamed a second time. 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. Then 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. Why the east wind? The east is where the desert is. Remember? The desert is east. And when the winds blow from the east, hot and dry. No rain. Hot and dry. So, very important point. All the people hearing it would understand. If you got an east wind, you're in trouble. 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. The thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump and full ears. Pharaoh awoke. He sits straight up in bed. It was a dream. Verse 9. The chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my faults today. Oh my. I remember a fellow in prison. Once Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. We dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own meaning. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. Verse 13. As he interpreted to us, so it turned out. I was restored to my office, the baker was hanged. Then Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was hurriedly brought out of the dungeon. When he had shaved himself, He'd had no amenities during this long 2 years in prison. So he has to get presentable before he comes before Pharaoh. When he'd shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came in before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I've had a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. I've heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it. Joseph answered Pharaoh. Okay, this is the right answer. It is not I. El will give Pharaoh a favorable answer. Okay? God, my God, the God of the Israelites. Okay. By the way, you notice here in these passages they are called Hebrews. Do you know where they get the name Hebrew? There is in Egyptian history a word that's similar, and it's called Aberu. And the Aberu were the poorest and the least educated, the sort of lowest of the slaves. In Egyptian literature, they're described the way people in Western Europe today would probably describe the gypsies. Okay? They just sort of wander around everywhere, building nothing, establishing nothing, just sort of foraging off the land. So if that be the case, if that's the word, then whenever they're being called Hebrews, not today, but long, long ago, it was a term of derision. It was a term of derision. It was a put-down term. Okay. So, verse 25. Joseph said to Pharaoh, Pharaoh's dreams are one and the same. You had two, but they mean the same thing. El has revealed to Pharaoh what El is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, as are the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is, as I told Pharaoh, El has shown to Pharaoh what El is about to do. There will come 7 years of great plenty throughout all the land of Egypt. After them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. It'll be so bad, people will forget that they had 7 good years. Verse 33. Now therefore, Joseph suggests, let Pharaoh select a man who is discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land, and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plenteous years. 1/5, 20%. Let Pharaoh tax the people 20% for 7 years. And everything you take in that taxation, store it up. Let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and lay up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. That is, don't eat it up. That food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to befall the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. Skip to verse 39. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since El has shown you all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Verse 42. Receiving his signet ring from his hand. Okay, and removing his signet ring from his hand. Now let's stop and think about this. When we were in China a few years ago, one of the things that they sold were special little stamps. And if you ordered one of these stamps one day, they would bring the finished product to you the next morning in your hotel. You were having breakfast, they would deliver it. And this little stamp could be your initials, if you wanted it to be. They carved during the night. They get it fixed up for you. This little stamp could be your initials or your name if it wasn't too long, or it could be, a bird, an animal, whatever. The point of these little stamps was that they also wanted to sell you some wax, usually red. And so from this point on, if you wanted to make something look official, you could melt a little blob of this red wax on any piece of paper and then stamp your own stamp into it. Now, in biblical times, on into the Roman Empire and so on, the lead officials wore their stamp on their rings. You've seen them do this in movies. Writing materials back in those days did not bend very well. If you tried to bend them, they would break. So you rolled them. You would roll them up like a scroll and then tie them. But right where the last layer came over, you would affix a blob of hot wax and then imprint the signet into it, so that if anyone unrolled the scroll, it would break the wax, and the recipient could tell someone's looked at this who's not supposed to. Now that's what PSO does to your electric meter. They put a little bit of lead there on your electric meter so that if anyone's gone into it who's not supposed to, they can tell. There's a special little imprint that goes into the lead. Notice how significant it was when Jesus told the story of the prodigal son. He's given up his birthright. He says to his father, in effect, I wish you were dead so that I had my share of the inheritance now while I'm young enough to enjoy it. And the father jeopardizes the rest of the family by carving up what he has and giving the younger son his share. He goes and wastes it all. Comes home penniless, broke, starving to death. And what's one of the first things that happens? The father says, put the gold ring on his hand. It's not just any gold ring, it's a signet. He restores him to sonship. He restores him to sonship. So when Joseph is given the ring, Pharaoh makes a very dramatic presentation. He takes off the signet ring and hands it to Joseph, and it means whatever Joseph stamps, he stamps for me. Whatever Joseph says, he says for me. You couldn't give a much more dramatic way of passing the power on to Joseph. Verse 42, removing his signet ring from his hand, Pharaoh put it on Joseph's hand. He arrayed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in the chariot of his second in command. And they, officials of Pharaoh, cried out in front of him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Wow. The ring, the gold chain. You've seen university presidents and so on. They wear these beautiful medallions as signatures of their office when you have formal processions at graduation and other times. These special medals, these medallions that show people who you are. So, has the gold ring. He has the gold chain around his neck. Beautiful clothes, his own charioteer. And whenever his chariot goes through the streets of the city, someone out ahead says, bow the knee to Joseph. Okay. Well, things are going really well. Verse 46. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Know anybody else who got started at age 30? Jesus. Jesus was 30 was the age. It was the age. It became a very significant number down through Israeli history. And so here it is. Joseph was 30 when he really became Pharaoh's right-hand man, and Jesus begins his ministry when he turns 30. Verse 48. Joseph gathered up all the food of the 7 years when there was plenty in the land of Egypt and stored up food in the cities. He stored up in every city the food from the fields around it. Verse 50. During this time, Joseph decided to have a family. He had 2 sons whom Asenath, daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph named the first son Manasseh. Verse 52, the second he named Ephraim. Okay. Verse 53, the 7 years of plenty that prevailed in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in every country, but throughout the land of Egypt there was bread, because they had saved it up, of course. Okay, verse 57. All the world came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine became severe throughout the world. Okay, now pause just a second here. There are people who, when it says the world, they think it means the whole planet Earth. When Noah experienced a flood, they think it covered the whole earth. Somebody opened a door into the side of my car, a big, high-up, pickup kind of door. I didn't see it, but there was a chink in, an indentation in the side of my car. So I've been told by the dealership there's one guy in Tulsa who does wonders with hail damage and so on. This shouldn't be a major thing. Go check it out with this guy. So I called him just before 12 noon that day, and I said, may I bring my car and let you look at it? He said, sure. So I drove over there, and he looked at it, and he said, it cost you $35. I said, when can you fix it? He said, what are you doing the next 30 minutes? I said, I'm waiting for you to fix my car. And he said, okay. So it was really amazing to me to watch. He forced a little divider just a little bit down through the window, back door, just to spread it just a little bit. Then he put a very hard sheet of plastic down in past my window glass. And then he stuck a tool down through there. And by using leverage, the lower end of it was rubbing against that little dimple. And he was, and I sat there and watched him as he just gradually removed that little dimple from the backside. Just took it out. But he knew who I was. He'd seen me on television, so he wanted to talk religion while he's working. So he's removing this little dimple, and all of a sudden he said, you ever seen the Grand Canyon? I said, I have. Well, he said, did you know that was started by the Great Flood? I said, which one? The one about Noah. I said, really? Oh, yeah. I got a friend, and he went out there, and he picked up rocks. Same flood that Noah had. And I want to get through with my car. I gotta go back to work here, So there are people who read the Bible, and when they hear the world, they think the planet Earth. No, it was the world they knew. The world they knew. The Mediterranean world. In Genesis, when it's telling you where Eden was, it circumscribes, this ancient storyteller circumscribes the world that he knew. He says Eden was where 4 great rivers came together. Tigris, Euphrates, the river that flows through the land of Cush, and we know where Cush was. It was another word for Ethiopia. And the one where onyx and bdellium are found in great amounts, that's India. So we're talking about the Indus or the Ganges. So you just find the place where the Nile, the Tigris, Euphrates, and the Indus or Ganges cross, and you have the Garden of Eden. Of course, they don't cross. They never did cross. What the storyteller has done is circumscribe his world. He only knows Africa just as far as Ethiopia. That's it. He knows Africa as far as Ethiopia. He knows east as far as the Indus or the Ganges. He knows north as far as Tigris, Euphrates, and modern-day Iraq. He knows Mediterranean Sea. That's all he knows. So the world was not very big for him. Not very big for these storytellers. They didn't have 6 o'clock news, 10 o'clock news. They were shepherds who might not go 50 miles in their whole lifetimes. You understand? These people who are telling the stories. So, a famine over all the world that this storyteller knew throughout the world. Well, if everybody's coming to buy grain and you're listening to this storyteller, you know what's about to happen. That means Joseph's brothers are also without food. They're without food. And the plot thickens at this point. Chapter 42. See, we've been dealing only with Joseph, and suddenly we go back up to Canaan. When Jacob learned, that's the father, remember, there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you sit here looking at each other?" That's the way they would say it today. "I've heard there's grain in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die. Why are you sitting around here under the tent? We're all starving to death." Verse 3. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. But Jacob did not send Joseph's brother Benjamin with his brothers, for he feared that harm might come to him. Now remember that Benjamin is the only full brother Joseph has, same mother. Rachel had just 2. She had Joseph. Later, when she was birthing Benjamin, it was a very difficult birth, we were told a couple of weeks ago, and she died. And she was buried at a little nowhere place called Bethlehem. Bethlehem. So Jacob loved these 2 best because they were the only 2 he had from Rachel. The other 10, different mothers. 3 different mothers, remember. Leah had 6, and the 2 handmaids had 2 each. Rachel had 2. Verse 6. Now Joseph was governor over the land. We know that, right? It was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. I mean, if everybody else is bending the knee, you can be sure these shepherds from Canaan are going to bend the knee before this guy. Now when Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he said. And they said, "From the land of Canaan, to buy food." Now, you don't know this yet, but we'll get to it a little bit later in the story. He's speaking Egyptian to them through an interpreter. Later, they will speak to each other, and he understands exactly what they're saying, but they don't know he understands what they're saying because it says he had been speaking to them through an interpreter. So he's speaking Egyptian to them, and an interpreter is barking out his orders to them, his questions to them, and they don't recognize him. Now, why would that be? Well, several reasons here. Number 1, Joseph was younger than they were. Okay. They were older. They were men when he was still a boy. All implications are he was only a teenager when he had that fancy coat, robe that he wore everywhere. A teenage boy. Teenagers change a lot. But not only that, of course, now he looks like an Egyptian. He's been there all these years. And so, hairstyle, headdress, linen garment that he wore, signet ring, gold chain, never would have dreamed. Last time they saw him, they'd thrown him down in a well, then hauled him out and sold him to some slave traders. Years have passed. They don't recognize him. So that's not a stretch of the imagination. You can see that. Let's go to verse 9. He said to them, Joseph said to them, "You are spies. You've come to see the nakedness of the land." In other words, you're from some other country. You want to see Egypt on her knees during this famine. I know you're here to take advantage of us while we're down. That's what he's saying to them. They said to him, "No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We're all sons of one man. That is, we haven't just gotten together to plot against you. We're brothers. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies." But he said to them again, "No, you've come to see the nakedness of the land." And they said, "We, your servants, are 12 brothers. They explain it to him again. "We are 12 brothers, the sons of a certain man in the land of Canaan. The youngest, however, is now with our father, and one is no more." They think surely Joseph is dead by this time. But Joseph said to them, "It is just as I've said to you. You are spies. Here is how you shall be tested. As Pharaoh lives. Now notice here, he is sort of uttering an oath, if you would. As Pharaoh lives, may so and so happen. In our speech, we say, in the name of God. I mean, even in beautiful ceremonies like weddings, the bride starts to place the ring on the groom's finger, and she says, in the name of God, I, Rebecca, take you, George. As surely as God is true to God's name, I will be true to what I'm saying to you. That's the idea. And so here, as sure as Pharaoh lives, you shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Let one of you go and bring your brother, while the rest of you remain in prison. Now notice he'll change the conditions a little bit later. Later he says he'll just keep one of them. But at first he says, I'm going to keep all but one. One of you go back, get your younger brother. This is his full brother Benjamin. He's eager to see him. Let one of you go and bring your brother, while the rest of you remain in prison, in order that your words may be tested. Verse 17, and he put them all together in prison for 3 days. Let them think about it. Verse 19, if you are honest men, here he changes the conditions. Instead of all but one staying, let one stay where you are in prison. The rest of you shall go and carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me. They said to one another, alas, we are paying the penalty for what we did to our brother. We saw his anguish when he pleaded with us, but we would not listen. That is why this anguish has come upon us. They remember that day when they sold him. Verse 23. Here comes the part I was telling you. They did not know that Joseph understood them, since he spoke with them through an interpreter. He turned away from them and wept. That is, he doesn't let them see him, but he is moved. They were not moved when he begged them, please don't do this to me. Please don't do this to me. And they sold him anyway. And now that he knows it's right there on their hearts, in their minds, he's the sensitive one. He weeps, but not where they can see him. He turns away and weeps and wipes his eyes, and then he returned and spoke to them. Still in Egyptian, in Egyptian. Verse 25, Joseph then gave orders to fill their bags with grain, but he told those who worked for him, return every man's money to his sack, and give them provisions, something for them to eat on their journey. And this was done for them. They loaded their donkeys. Now here you have lots of pronouns again. When it says they loaded their donkeys, it means Joseph's men. Joseph's men load the donkeys, because it's Joseph's men who are going to put the money in the mouth of the sacks and close them up, and they don't know the money's been returned. Money that they used to pay for the grain. So when they loaded the donkeys, it means Joseph's men did it. Now, when one of them, the brothers, opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at their first lodging place, he saw his money at the top of the sack. He said to his brothers, my money has been put back. Here it is in my sack. Now, you would think it would make them happy? No. It makes them look like thieves. At this, they lost heart and turned trembling to one another, saying, what is this that God has done to us? Isn't that amazing? God hasn't been mentioned by them in a long, long time. Joseph has talked quite a bit about God. They have not talked about God. They didn't ask God whether he wanted them to throw Joseph down in a well, whether God wanted them to sell him into slavery. But now that things are not going well for them, what has God done to us here? When they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them. Verse 33. Then the man, they're talking about Joseph, but of course they don't know it's Joseph. Then the man, the Lord of the land, said to us, by this I shall know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me, take grain for the famine of your households, and go your way. Bring your youngest brother to me, and I shall know that you are not spies, but honest men, Then I will release your brother to you, and you may trade. From this point on, you may trade in the land. As they were emptying their sacks, there in each one's sack was his bag of money. When they and their father saw their bundles of money, they were dismayed. And their father Jacob said to them, I am the one you have bereaved of children. Joseph is no more. He believes he's dead. Simeon is no more. He's the one they left down there in that Egyptian prison. And now you would take Benjamin? All this has happened to me. Then Reuben said to his father, you may kill my 2 sons. Okay, he's willing to offer up his own 2 sons with the proposal he's about to make. You may kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him, Benjamin, back to you. Put him in my hands, and I will bring him back to you. But Jacob said, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother, Joseph, is dead, and he alone is left. Now, how does that make all the other brothers feel? There are 10 of them, but he says, Joseph is dead. I've only got 1 left, Benjamin. What about us? What about the 10 of us? Do you see? Jacob is not learning fast. Not learning fast. This is the only one I've got left, he says. If harm should come to him on the journey that you are to make, you would bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to Sheol. In other words, I would die. I would absolutely die. I've got to go baptize a baby. So if you haven't been to church, don't rush off. We're going to sing your favorite hymns. Next Sunday will be January the 3rd, and we'll start with chapter 43 and see if we can get this mess straightened out here. All right?